Hey guys, today I'm back in Besiege, and I'm finally making a tank. I don't know why I didn't do this sooner, to be honest, because this seems like a great build. So, let's get right into it. So I'm just starting out in the sandbox, and the first thing I want to do here is make the engine. Now, I've made a whole bunch of engines before, but this time I want to try making my own. And to start out with that, you can see here I'm putting out a bunch of gears, and I'm really just trying to get a feel for what would be good. And I really liked this design, where I have sort of a planetary gear thing rotating around on the outside like this, and I figured I could do something cool with it. So I ended up surrounding the gears completely with these gears, and after that gave it a quick spin, and I thought it looked pretty cool. And you can see I separated these out a little bit, and my next goal is to get these small planetary gears to somehow be locked to the rest of the gear mechanism. Now, what I mean by that is as the planetary gears rotate, I want that rotation to be carried out to an output shaft and not just get lost somewhere in the system. And to do that, you can see here I have a gear just rotating like this, and I'm extracting out that center rotation, and it's gonna make it easier for me to connect it back into the machine. Now, I realize this is already making like no sense, so what I mean by that is I'm using a couple of these other gears to connect it back into the other side of the machine, and what this is going to do is make sure that as I rotate the planetary gear, it's going to have to rotate all the other gears. And this sort of works, but I accidentally linked it the wrong way, and the planetary gears, instead of being able to freely rotate, were forced to be stuck in place. So to fix that, I needed to add in one more gear so that it rotated in the opposite direction, and with that, you can see the planetary gears on top are rotating, and now if I rotate any gear in the system, it should mean that all of the other gears will have a predictable output. Now, I realized having all these small gears on the outside was really inefficient, and what I could do is move these gears in like this, and I could use a 4-bar linkage. Now, the 4-bar linkage uses 4 bars, and as the first gear spins around, it'll actually make the second gear rotate in the same direction. And you can see that happening here. These two gears are now locked together, so as I rotate one of them, the other one rotates at the same speed, and that gives me the required kind of locking motion that I need to make this work. So with half of this working, I ended up just duplicating it over to the other side, and with that, I ended up just having to hook up the 4-bar linkage as well. And finally here, you can see I'm rotating. As the whole thing rotates around, it looks pretty good, and I like the way it looks, but there's still no way for me to power it. And to do that, you see I'm putting in a couple wooden blocks like this, and on the edge of this, I'm actually putting down a spring. Now I'm able to contract the spring in, and as I do that, since all the gears are locked together, as I rotate the planetary gears around, it forces the whole engine to spin, and you can see that happening here. I'm actually able to power the whole engine just off of one spring. Now, this isn't really that great yet, so what I wanted to do is add in springs to all the other ones, but actually I had a small collision problem. One of these swivel joints was interfering with the wood block, and it wasn't letting the engine rotate. So what I had to do is push out the center gear, and that wasn't great. The problem with pushing out the center gear is it means I have to put in 2 other gears, and doing that creates not only a lot of slack in the system, but also creates a point where the gears can slip past each other. This is Besiege, so gears aren't that great, so I have to be kind of careful with that. But with that done, you can see here, it still rotates just fine, and I have all those wooden blocks in place. Now, I ended up deleting the springs, and what I wanted to do instead was use ropes. Now, the reason I wanted to use ropes here is that ropes are a lot more powerful than springs, so in theory, it's a lot better, but the ropes can be a little more tricky to get working. And to control these here, what I'm doing is having 5 timers. Now, the first timer is just setting a constant loop so that it turns on and off. I ended up deciding that half a second on, half a second off felt about right. I ended up setting the second timer to completely just mimic that one. Then after that, I had all the subsequent timers turn on half a second later, and you see here I get this cascading pattern. So the first one turns on, then the second one, then the third one, then the fourth one, and these timers should allow the ropes to contract at the correct times and start to rotate up the engine. Now, this is super easy to implement because I just need 5 timers, and after I set all the ropes in place, it sort of worked. It was moving around, but you can see here it was very jittery, and also one thing is that the ropes are really getting contracted in, and it felt like they weren't getting expanded out properly. So that wasn't great since there's a lot of tension in the system, and I realized a better way to do this would be to actually just use a sensor. Now, I didn't want to do this at first since the logic's a little more complicated. The idea of using a sensor is instead of setting constant raw timings into the engine's able to slow down or speed up depending on its load, and it should perform a little bit better. Now, the sensor you see turns on and off as this gear rotates, and I'm going to use that turning on and off to signal when I need to pull the ropes in. Now, the logic got kind of complicated for this, honestly, so I ended up speeding through it a bit, but after setting all that, you can see it still wasn't really working. And the solution was to turn up the speed to 2 times, and for some reason this worked. My guess is that turning up the speed allowed it to build up a little bit of momentum, and this made the motion just smooth enough to keep going. And after I had that, I ended up adding on a second set of ropes, and this dramatically improved the engine. It was starting to rotate a lot smoother now, and it seemed like it had a bit more power as well. Now, to hopefully improve the stability a bit, I'm adding in a couple of swivel joints and a brace, and this is to hopefully keep those wooden blocks straight up and down. Now, when I did this, for some reason it made it a lot more glitchy, and you see it just fell apart a lot more often, but it would work sometimes, and you can see here the motion's a lot better. So with that done, I ended up copying it over to the top and also the bottom here, and with that done, you can see here the engine rotating. And with that, I wanted to get rid of the pins and make this completely be able to sit on its own. Now, once I do that, I should be able to put it right on the tank treads and get this working. So I ended up deleting those joints, like I said, and putting in some braces to hold it all together. And with that done, it fell on the ground, and it started to actually move. I wasn't expecting it to be this powerful, so the fact that it's able to move itself like this, I was really confident it was gonna be able to move a tank around. Now, I very loosely based my engine off of this engine, and I made this one a few months ago for my Besiege competition on my Discord server, and I really like the way this one ended up turning out, but it had like no power at all. Now, with the engine finally complete, the next thing I wanted to work on was the tank treads, and I already had a pretty good idea of what I wanted to do here, and you see I'm starting out by putting down a few gears spaced apart like this, and after that I'm putting down some steering hinges. Now, I wanted to test how these collide with the gears, and it seems like they only collide on the heads, and in this case that's really good, because you can see as I put down a chain of these here, I should be able to have the gear teeth go in between the heads, and I should be able to pull the tank tread along, but it's still able to work like a chain like this, so it should work pretty well. So to test this out a little bit more, you can see I'm putting a sample of the tank tread right below one of these gears, and as the gear rotates, it sort of pulls it along. I realized though I had it rotated the wrong way, so after rotating it 90 degrees, it looked really good. It pulled it along fully, and it didn't seem to bind up or anything at all. So I ended up doubling the length of the chain, and it got through this entire length too. So I thought, might as well just go for the full length at this point. And it took a little while, and I realized I did this in a kind of an inefficient way, but I wrapped it all the way around the edge of the gear like this, and after that, just copied over the top of the tank tread as well, and just copied it over to the other side like this, and finally here, just tuned it up to get it all connected together. And it seems to rotate pretty well on its own, but the tank tread does fall off the gears after a certain amount of time, so to hopefully stop that, I'm putting down some wood pieces right on the edge of the tread to hopefully keep it from just popping off. And this seemed to mostly solve the problem. You can see here, it looks pretty good, but when it gets up to high speeds, or whenever it gets jostled too much, it can still get kicked out of the middle. So I ended up adding a couple more of these wood blocks in the middle as well. And with that done, you can see here at the high speed, it still seems to be fine. But when I let it go on its own, it's a little more problematic. So you can see all of the smoke coming off of it, and that means that I have a lot of stuff rubbing. And I'm assuming that's the tread rubbing directly against the wood. And after a certain amount of time, the whole thing falls apart, and I think it's just because of all that extra stress. So I ended up deciding to replace the wood pieces with gears. And what these gears do is they allow it to freely rotate, but they also lock it in place like the wood. But the problem with the gears is they do bind up sometimes, and they still don't allow it to fully move correctly. So I ended up replacing the gears with just swivel joints, and that seemed to be much better. So with that done, I ended up linking two sets of these together, and you can see as it moves, it actually looks pretty good. The chain's binding up a little bit, and I'll come back to that in a bit, but for the most part, not half bad. So with that done, it's finally time to get the engine on this, and to do that, I ended up just roughly positioning it somewhere where it looked good, but I had a small problem because connecting it to the tank tread was actually kind of tricky. I just had to be careful not to interfere with the tank tread at all, or else it would start rubbing against it and cause the same problems as before. But I ended up getting it connected up like this, and you can see here, after just bracing the front part of it and deleting some pins, I ended up letting it run, and it actually seems to rotate just fine on its own. So at least now I have an engine rotating on top of the treads, and the next step is to get those treads powered by the engine. And to do that, I put a gear on the front like this, and that was a pretty big mistake, and I'll show you why in a second. But to connect it up, you can see here I'm putting down another 4-bar linkage, and these are just really convenient, so I ended up doing that here. And after that, you can see the engine kind of exploded, but after that, the engine seemed to be fine, but it wasn't really moving correctly, and I realized the problem is I just didn't brace some stuff quite right, and also I needed to move the gear in a little bit so it would mesh. Gears in this game are kind of annoying, but after that, it actually did seem to be rotating, but I noticed the chain was really binding up in the middle here, and it just looked bad. But I thought maybe the problem wasn't anything serious. I thought maybe because it was turning, it was just binding up a bit, and that if I was going straight or anything, it would just correct itself. So I ended up connecting the other side as well, but the problem still persisted, and it seemed to be pretty much equally as bad, and I realized the problem was that I'm trying to drive the tank tread from the front, and the issue with that is that as it rotates around, it's pulling on the top part of the tread and pushing on the bottom, which means that on the bottom, it's going to create a lot of extra slack, and that's what causes it to push up. But if I put it in the back, it's going to tension the bottom and then push on the top, and that ends up being a lot better. Now, it's still not perfect, so to fix that problem, I'm putting in some ropes like this, and what these ropes are going to do is pull in the tank tread and get rid of all of the extra slack. Now, this looked great at first. You see the top looks almost perfectly taut, bottom looks taut as well, but as it goes around, it ends up breaking the back, and I think it's because there's just too much tension on the tread. So I ended up deleting some extra bracing pieces from the front, and what I was going to do instead is use some pistons to push the tread out, and that was going to be my new tensioning system. And you see that working here. As I tension it, the top part of the tread gets really taut, and it's not too taut though, so it's still able to move around just fine. Now the next thing I wanted to work on here is the movement system, and to do that, you see I'm putting in a bunch of gears like this, and I'm using some grabbers. Now the grabbers, what they're gonna do are grab on the gears when I tell them to, and it's gonna allow me to either couple or decouple my motion, and this should allow me to move either forward or backward to each of the sides whenever I want to. And you can see that sort of motion here. The gear is able to freely rotate until I tell it to grab, and then it grabs on and starts rotating with it. So with that proof of concept done, I ended up streamlining the design a little bit to reduce the amount of gears I needed. And after that, I used a 4-bar linkage to connect up the output of the engine to everything else. And with that done, you can see I'm able to start to move the tread like this, and I'm able to also stop moving it, and then restart moving it again once I tell it to. So that part at least looked really good. And the next thing I wanted to do is focus on going backward. Now in order to do that, I need to add in an extra gear, which is a little annoying. That's because gears slip a lot in this game, as I've mentioned a few times. So every time I add in another gear, it's just adding more problems. But with that done, I ended up adding another gear here just to connect up the output of that. And finally here, going to test it. It will move backward, but it's binding up a lot. And I realized the problem is that I'm actually connecting it to the back wheel now, which means I'm connecting it to the wrong wheels. The same problem I had before. So this time I actually need to connect it up to the front part of the tread instead of the back. But in order to do that, my 4-bar linkage sort of has this weird geometry to it, and I forgot you can't drive 4-bar linkages like this. The reason that I can't do it this geometry is that as it starts to rotate, it's easier literally to just bend the braces than it is to actually rotate the tread. So it just chooses to bend all the braces like this, and then nothing gets done. The solution's actually not that bad. It's just to move the gear out of the way so that it gets a little bit of a better leverage on it, and after that, it's actually able to rotate it just fine. Now, if you look closely, you notice the tank's actually going a lot slower than before, and most of the clips I'm showing here are sped up. And it's because all of these extra gears seem to add a lot of load onto the engine, so it just doesn't work as well, and a lot of the time I'm having gears slip like this. So what I ended up deciding to do was streamline the design a ton, and you see here I just have 2 4-bar linkages going to the back like this, and I have the grabbers directly on the wheels. By doing this, for whatever reason, it seems to just perform a lot better, but I still have the advantage of being able to disable either side so it's able to turn. Now with this design, instead of using gears to go backward, what I'm actually going to do is just spin the engine in reverse if I need to go backward. Basically all I have to do is swap 2 signals, and you can see for short periods of time I'm able to go backward. So with the movement system pretty much as efficient as I can get it, the next thing to work on here is the gun. Now that's the part I was most excited for because I knew it was going to be a pretty fun build, and you can see here I'm using a bunch of half pipes to build up the barrel, and I'm going to use a bomb as my propulsion. Now the thing with the bomb is that it's pretty powerful, so I figured I could probably launch out a wooden block or something, and that's what I'm putting in the barrel here. So after I had that done, put into a piston like this, and once I tried hitting the block, nothing happened. I guess it wasn't powerful enough, so I added on 2 pistons, figuring that definitely was going to do it, but that still wasn't powerful enough. So I ended up adding on 4 pistons and a spiked ball, and that was enough to do it. And you can see I launched out that wooden block pretty far, but I figured I could do better with a ballast since they're a little bit lighter, and it's also just a single piece, so there's less friction, and that seemed to launch out pretty far. Now I ended up lowering the mass of the ballast just to see what would happen, and I don't know what I was expecting, but it just went away. Now here's a few more shots of that because I thought it was so funny. And if I try tracking it here, the crazy part is at 2% speed. First of all, you can see the jittering that it's having because the physics can't even keep up. And also it literally can just go through walls and stuff. I don't even know if that's ideal. I think I want to increase the mass a little bit so it doesn't do that. But I was just amazed at the amount of speed that this projectile had, and I thought for sure this would be great to have on the tank. So with that done, I ended up just moving and rotating it around like this. And once I got it into a pretty good spot, I ended up rotating it up just a little bit, and I had some problems with the bomb. The thing is, it's kind of hard to keep in place, and even once I do, just the explosion will set things on fire around it. So I ended up swapping it out for a grenade, and this ended up working out way better. The grenade will just detonate with a key press, and I don't need anything else to it, and also it doesn't set anything on fire around it. And on top of all that, it seems to be just as good for launching the ballast. So with that done, I ended up putting the gun in place, and also I wanted to put on the logic like this. So just rotated up in place, and I was gonna stick it right on the barrel since I didn't really have anywhere else to put it. But with that done, it was time to go for an endurance test here. So I started out by turning around fully, and I just wanted to go in a straight line for a very long time. Now I think this is like 40 times speed or something, and you can see the tank slowly creeps over to the left. I'm not exactly sure why it does that, but it doesn't really seem to affect its performance all that much. But you can see there, got all the way to the end, and still going fine. And I also wanted to do one test here, climbing over some rocks. Now this is notoriously difficult for any of my piston engines before, but this actually seemed to be able to do it. The big problem was really just grip. Nothing seemed to grab quite well, and I figured if I used some grabbers, I might have been able to do a little bit better, but still seemed to get over it fine, and it only ended up failing once I fell into this hole. Apparently a tank-sized hole will perfectly fit a tank, and I can't get out of it. And finally here, I just have a few last shots of me moving around and shooting. So guys, thanks for watching. This definitely turned out way better than I thought it was going to, especially the gun. I think it's just amazing. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them down below. Subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and otherwise, until next time.